Hey guys, good morning, or still morning. I can't believe how fast this week has gone. It is terrifying. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit through an article that I put up on LinkedIn. So this is the UK banking, how are you sleeping? It seems to have got a pretty good reaction from people in terms of actually engagement and the kind of level of questions that I've received through Twitter and email. So I'll attempt to answer a few of those as we go through, but equally if you've got any questions as I'm talking through, feel free to answer via Periscope or hit me up via Twitter in terms of while I'm doing this as well. So the UK banking how are you sleeping article very much for me was kind of a pre-dawn. The last year was very much a kind of a very long pre-fight setup in terms of all of the things that we saw for where we were coming with challenger banks. The advent of the Monzos and the Atoms, the Starlings, the Tandems, and really, given all of the things that we're seeing that these guys are going to be doing, and given the functionality that those guys are pulling through, then really how much is this really sort of concerning the players in the market, the established incumbent organizations and actually what they're doing? And I think there are a few pieces, particularly in this, that are kind of quite interesting. So, arguably when you go and talk to a pretty large banking organization, the thing that you hear back quite quickly is, yes, but how many customers do they really have? And yes, but isn't switching processes really, really slow? And actually, how do people come through in terms of doing this? I think there's a few sensible questions to answer. But before we maybe get into that, I think, it feels like the absolute perfect storm for all of these people coming through. I had the pleasure last night, actually, of interviewing Tom Blomfield, the CEO of Monzo, for FinTech Insider, which, if you haven't checked out FinTech Insider, that's our podcast that goes out weekly, interviewing some of the best and the brightest in fintech and banking. So that'll go out next week, so be sure to check that out. But a lot of these questions I sort of posed to him as well in terms of kind of where we're going. We see very much of a kind of a view when you start looking at some of the studies that have been conducted. And actually in the article I referenced the which best and worst banks that came out in December 2016, which looked at, are customers currently happy with banking? And if you look at the scales that are involved in those, a 5-point star rating where somebody like First Direct is getting 5 out of 5 stars for internet banking, it kind of feels like either there's two things going on. Either First Direct are absolutely killing it with their capability that they're doing, which, having had a look at it, doesn't feel like it's the case, or the bar of what is good within what digital banking actually is far, far, far too low. Now, for me, I think it's obvious that it's the second and not the first in terms of where these people are going. So, given the services and the capability that actually the likes of the Monzos and the Tandems will actually be bringing to the market in terms of what they're doing, then, it kind of feels like there's going to be quite a fundamental reset in what good looks like in terms of where we're going with both the digital banking services and actually what everyday banking looks like. The idea that your bank already has an app, which Jason Bates, actually part of 11FS, wrote a really, really good article, which you should check out. The idea that my bank already has an app kind of goes away pretty quickly when you start to see people doing really innovative things in this space. Our argument with regards to digital banking is really we don't know what a digital bank looks like yet, because fundamentally in the market we haven't seen it. And I think, we're at a bit of a precipice this year with everything coming through, but I think we're definitely going to be seeing some coming to the market soon. So with regards to aren't customers happy? Well, I kind of think customers are happy with the level of capability that they're seeing today, but there can be so much more in terms of sort of doing it. I think the other thing to address here is, but people aren't switching. And this is a thing that, many banking executives say to us is, the government has spent so much money on this 7-day switching process, particularly in the UK, and we're really not seeing the level of movement that you would expect. Now, equally, we've seen that further abroad as well. You look at in the US the likes of Simple and Move, and sort of bringing forward the sort of promise of the dawn of change. But the amount of customers that have moved to these players are kind of very, very small. And that's why I actually think the UK market is so well placed for this level of disruption. I referred to it earlier as the kind of perfect storm, and very much that's what we're seeing. We're seeing very large incumbent organizations who are finding it quite difficult to transform the experiences and services that they're delivering. At the same time, we've got the FCA lowering the barriers of entry in a controlled fashion with help from the Bank of England as well. And then we've got the government putting in place a 7-day switching process, as well as spending lots and lots of time on marketing actually promoting that. So, at the point where actually it becomes a very clear capability to customers that actually you can switch your bank account in 7 days in a very, very secure manner, I expect the numbers of those things to jump up. One of the major arguments I always sort of put forward for this really is at the point where actually customers have got something good to move to. And when I say good to move to, I kind of mean less about bribery of £100 here and there to do it, and actually real good services that actually start to match up to their expectations that are probably being set outside of the financial services industry currently. Then I think the numbers we've seen last quarter, I think quarter 4 of 2016 was about 250,000 people switching. I think at the point where somebody's actually got something really beneficial to move to, then I think we're going to see those numbers rapidly jump up. I think the lateral I sort of draw on, and probably the word of caution to a certain degree. Having looked at, particularly on the Monzo front, I've been a Monzo customer now for a year, and the service and the capability, the sort of level of experience in the way that they bring real sort of warmth and humanity to the digital services that they're actually offering is fantastic. But I think the sort of condition and the warning from other industries that we've seen is, how do you get into the psyche of the general public? Now, the lateral I draw in the article was very much about general insurance, and this is an industry I've kind of spent a lot of time working in as well. The aggregators coming into the insurance space in 2002 were pretty low level. They didn't make a great splash to start with in terms of what they were doing. But actually, at the point where they started to use above the line marketing and started to really sort of increase themselves and move themselves into the psyche of the general public. The UK population were aware of what Money Supermarket was, what Compare the Market actually was. The point where they were considered a financial brand was the point where mass adoption of aggregators was taken up. So, I kind of think there's interesting niches that people can pick up, and obviously a lot of these challenger organizations are initially going for that early adopter, the tech disruptor space in terms of getting those numbers going. But if you really want to be making a significant dent in the customer base that you've got, then that actually allows you or requires you to sort of step up your level of marketing to really sort of make those things go forwards. So I guess the question on this one is, given that we're in the sort of eye of this perfect storm, given that, like we said earlier on, technology has lowered the barriers of entry, that regulations like what the FCA, the PRA, the Bank of England have done to allow more people to come through, and that we've got the rise of what looks like 3 or 4 very well-armed challenger bank organisations coming to the market, what's really going to happen? And I think this is a pretty interesting question, and actually I think is fundamental to whether the success of this is going to happen or not. I think if we look to signs of success, the amount of people that have signed up for Monzo over the last year, we've got 100,000 people. I think the bar is that they've just reached in terms of doing it, which, for a company that currently is only issuing prepaid cards, is pretty impressive in terms of what they've got. I think the main thing that really impresses me from the Monzo perspective, and actually, this came out really well in the interview that Tom did with us yesterday, was how much people love that brand. it's so refreshing in this market within financial services to see a brand that really, I think, sort of personifies a movement. I was trying to explain this to some of my non-fintech friends the other day, and the idea that actually this feels like a kind of a change of guard, really. It must feel very similar to other movements in the music industry, or even into much more sort of politically minded sides of things as well. But it kind of feels like this change of mentality in an industry that's so fundamental to everyday life for people is very, very significant. And actually, a lot of those things, a lot of those changes, a lot of those movements have been spurred by people or brands that people can really fundamentally identify with. And I think that's the thing that stands apart for me for people like Monzo is I kind of feel the brand is something that I can really, really get behind. I can really relate to what it is that they're trying to do. And actually, like I said earlier on, the sort of humanity and the warmth that comes through in terms of the experiences that they deliver just set them apart for me in terms of kind of where they're going. So I think the future for these guys is very, very bright. We spent some time with Tandem. I think very similarly the work that Ricky Knox and the guys are doing there is pretty exceptional. And I think the opportunity for them and Monzo particularly, I think really sort of stands them apart. We've got some interesting sort of questions coming through here. So if I maybe answer a couple of questions off the back of the article, and let's see where we go. If there's any other questions you'd like answering, then feel free to hit me up on Twitter right now at David Breer, and happy to answer those when I come through to them as well. So first through, we had a question from Gary Vegan. So what feature, experience or service is going to make my mum want to switch? And I think this is a particularly good question because, tying into the idea that, if you really want to make a dent in the market, then, mass market adoption is going to be critical. My mum is always a bar for me as regard to the simplicity needed with the experiences in terms of doing it. But even her now as a Monzo customer is really sort of loving the level of control and the level of experience that they actually get through doing it. It's simple features like being able to turn on and off your card for contactless payments. For people who are feeling very concerned about security, very concerned about what might happen and how people can take your money, and all of the scary things that people sort of really kind of hype up on the news in terms of doing it, then very much kind of allowing people to have that level of control over their banking experience is really an obvious first step. So I kind of think that first thing is really just about putting people in control of their finances. Probably the second one is the instance and immediacy of actually being able to talk to somebody. This seems reasonably sort of ironic, given that a lot of these challenges are actually coming through as pure digital plays. But my mum she's on WhatsApp, she's on Facebook Messenger, she is doing those things, and actually now is starting to prefer to use that type of instant messaging capability to interact with people. So, if she has a problem or a question, being able to use the instant messaging service in Monzo has proved actually really beneficial for her. And again, that kind of breaking down of the barriers in the way that the Monzo chat representatives actually talk to people is very, very significant. So, talking to people like a human, for starters, is a very significant step forward in terms of what she needs to see. There was another question here that came through from James Taylor. So James is the founder at FinTech Network. And James asked, I'd be really interested in a bit of detail around the statement you made in the article. The services the challengers are delivering are fundamentally different to those from the banks and the current market. And now I think the thing on this one that I was really sort of trying to highlight was, for me, I think the services that we're seeing, and this is something, at 11FS that we actually talked to many banks about before, is if you kind of look at the difference between products and features, if you look at the difference between commodity analog products, which is where most people in the banking industry are, and kind of advanced digital services, these are fundamentally different in terms of what they'll do. Most people in the banking industry are still very much focused on the sales side of things in terms of what they're doing. So it's selling of analog products through new digital distribution channels, which for us at 11FS is very much kind of missing the point, really. If you look at the argument that the existing products that are being sold through most of the banking organizations are pretty much in the same constructs that they've been for the last 15, 20, maybe even up to 100 years. And really, they haven't embraced digital much beyond the distribution channels. So at the point where actually we can start to see much more interesting, much more engaging, and taking advantage of the new technological advancements that have actually happened in the way that Monzo has around data manipulation, or even very simplistic things in terms of notifications, then you very much start to feel like you are part of a service and an experience that really is on your side. Again, Tom talks about this in the interview that will come out next week on FinTech Insider, which we've had things like SMSs and capability to alert people of going towards their overdrafts for the best part of a decade now, and a lot of the reasons for the lack of adoption of those things into being sort of core elements of the services that banks are actually providing is that it's pretty much business model negative. If people are not going into their overdraft, or if they're not getting those punitive charges being laid along them, then actually how are banks making money from current accounts? And this is really, I think, the paradox in sort of banking is we have a sort of a misconception that banking is free. Everybody can get a current account. The free setup is there, but very much they're set up like bear traps. They make money from people having problems going into overdrafts that they weren't aware that they were going to. So in the way that Monzo has implemented something like push notifications to allow me to know exactly where I am with my finances, that type of revenue stream just goes away. And we're definitely starting to see, Frankie Woodhead from Barclays was on FinTech Insider a couple of weeks ago and actually made the comment that, Barclays are moving towards this type of service, but it's definitely being slow coming in terms of where we're going. Another very interesting sort of line of questions that came from Igor from Fedor. What is the goal of this article in this first place? And that's a pretty good question right there. Increasingly, we're just trying to have more dialogue with people. The fintech scene generally, both in the UK and more globally, is best when actually it's done openly. Actually having discussions around these topics and actually moving forward everybody's collective understanding of doing it. I think gone are the days where the preachers stand up at the front of a kind of a keynote hall and they're the only ones that are heard. We actually was at a really interesting summit this week called the Rainmaking Summit, which Liz Lumley put on, and this was the whole premise of that. It's more about having dialogue and having communication with the real interesting people who are doing things in the market. The point of this article was to start a conversation, and start a conversation we have. There was an interesting comment that Igor actually said as well, was banks still have too much money to care about their customers. The future is quite clear to me. There will be a platform that will use the banks as the backbone, and where we will kick off as creating kick-ass services to end customers. Now, I think this is always an interesting one, and I've written quite a lot in the past about bank as a platform and bank as a service. For me, personally, I kind of think this is quite a slippery slope for the banks to actually go in. We're doing quite a lot of work with probably the most interesting players in this space in terms of what they're doing. So people like Bud in the UK, very much in the bank as a service mold, looking at integrating other services, providing no products of their own, but integrating many services into a single interface that becomes a little bit more intelligent in terms of what they're doing. Further down the stack, we're seeing very, very interesting players like Solaris Bank in Berlin. Equally, we're seeing people like Rails Bank in the UK, who are doing very interesting things with bank as a platform plays. Solaris Bank particularly we're pretty close to in terms of what they're doing and how that work's going. And I think that offers a very unique opportunity for people getting into the market and using the rails that the people like Solaris Bank are actually establishing to get into the market. And now if you think, initially that conjures up small fintech players that can come into the market to get onto that platform. But actually most of the conversations that people who are coming to 11FS about potential new bank builds, there's an amazing amount of big technology firms and big retail players who are fascinated by financial services. You know, I think the fascination is, given an industry that's been around for so long, how is the services so kind of under-refined in terms of where they're going? And now if you think the big tech firms and actually the big retail firms as well, like House of Fraser, we've seen invest pretty heavily in tandem in recent weeks in terms of where they're going. Well, these guys have got probably more money than a lot of the banks to invest in, particularly in the R&D approach. These guys have adopted agile practices and processes in a much more lucid form of than a lot of the people that are actually out there. And for me, have probably more customers who actually like their services and like their practices than really a lot of the banks do. So, you know, in a space where we're looking for people to come through who might be challenges to the banks, this might not just be about fintech players using bank as a platform services. It might actually be very large retailers and very large tech firms. You know, the tech firms themselves, you know, love the idea of getting into banking, but don't really want a lot of the hassle of the regulation or the setup or ensuring that all of these practices and processes are established. Now, you know, a bank as a platform play might offer these guys a very good in to allow them to jump into something that really allows them to get into the market without really getting their hands dirty too much with regards to regulation. So I think it's going to be super interesting to see how this one pans out. But bank as a platform, bank as a service, for me, absolutely is the future of banking. Tom actually, and we've had Tom Blomfield at Monzo speaks very passionately about what marketplace banking can be. Obviously, Starling Bank, we've seen with Anne Bowden's comments around how they see banking going forwards with regards to marketplace banking. Again, Tandem, Ricky Knox was speaking on FinTech Insider a couple of weeks ago, very similar approach. So I kind of see that that movement towards this play being pretty significant. And, you know, again, I definitely see that bank as a platform, bank as a service, definitely the future of banking for me. One last question, and I think this is a pretty fundamental one actually, and it's the one that a lot of the people that actually come out and, you know, really sort of push back on what the customers of the likes of the Monzos, the likes of the Starlings, etc., you know, they're happy that, or not really concerned, I think is probably the way to say this, that they get people coming through with, you know, a Monzo getting 100,000 customers. They're not concerned by those things. And Linus's question, so Linus, you're the account executive at Contis Group. The question for me is, do they have a sustainable business model? And that is pretty damn fundamental, right? You know, I think this is probably the thing that's going to be most open to question and concern, really, is given that these players are smaller, given that they have much lower customers in terms of what they're doing, can they have a sustainable business model in terms of where they're at? Now, I think the answer to this one is probably twofold, and actually a little bit tied to the bank as a platform, bank as a service conversation as well. So when you are a very high operation cost entity, like pretty much most of the large banks actually are, then it's very difficult to make profit from low scale activities. You know, when you're a very large banking organisation and it costs you, maybe 160 to 200 pounds to run a current account, the level of revenue that you actually have to make from each individual customer is quite high. At the point where it's costing you maybe 10 euros, 6 euros to run a current account, like a lot of the players that will start to come into the market could do, then actually your ability to make profit and actually the scale of profit that has a potential is much higher. Now, all of this is actually well within the existing business models as well. So at the point where actually the new players coming to the market can start to unlock new potentials around business models. For example, like how do you monetize data for people more efficiently? We see players like Facebook, players like Google are, the data monetization side of things in terms of what they're doing becomes around about 70 to 80% of the revenue that those guys are making. So, who has more data on customers, their preferences, than the banking organizations? And I spoke about big data in an interview this week actually for a media outlet, and for me, the biggest untapped reference in most of the banks is still really breaking through those business models and actually delivering something with data that actually unlocks a new business model for these guys. At the point where you can start delivering win-wins with customers rather than just charging them and punishing them for retrospectively behavior that they wouldn't want to do, then it kind of feels like that's where we start to get to business models within banking that are, let's say, a little bit more sustainable. So I think that's probably, unless there is any questions from anybody listening to this now, speak now or wherever, hold your peace. I think that's probably the end of what we're doing. So thank you very much for tuning in. I will add this back into the LinkedIn post that I kind of put this out on. And if there's any more questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm at David Breer on Twitter, or you can get me on david at 11fs.co.uk. Thanks very much. Bye.